We're now going to turn to a couple of talks that help understand how cancer develops and set the stage for the role of environmental risk factors. So our next presenter is Ted Schettler, and Ted is the science director for the Science and Environmental Health Network. He is an MD. He's worked extensively with community groups and non-governmental organizations throughout the US and internationally, addressing many aspects of human health and the environment, and served on a number of advisory committees that EPA has had and National Academy of Sciences as well. Ted is an incredibly synthetic and integrated thinker, so he is just the person that we need to talk about this topic. And it comes after several years of thinking and working on this and then publishing a book on the ecology of breast cancer. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Polly, and thank you very much to the organizers and supporters of this conference for the opportunity to be here today to talk about multifactorial origins of cancer and the implications for primary prevention. This is the cancer control continuum from the National Cancer Institute, beginning, as we've heard, with etiology and then moving to prevention, detection, diagnosis, treatment, and survivorship. And today's conference is focusing on these first two, etiology and prevention. And historically, a lot of attention in the prevention column has been placed on individual behaviors and individual approaches, what we can do as individuals to try to prevent cancer. And whereas that's been a historic emphasis, I think we're beginning to see more and more attention being paid at a more community and ecological, eco-social level, and I'll talk a little bit about examples of that. But I do want to go through those sequentially, beginning with etiology and then moving to prevention. And as Mary has just told us, there are many different kinds of cancer, so their causes obviously vary, and it's hard to say anything that's absolutely generalizable to all of them, except for the fact that for every kind of cancer, we do have to ask ourselves what we actually mean when we say the cause of cancer. What does that actually mean to us? Because the reality is, for most cancers, not all, but for most cancers, they arise from a complicated collection of factors, not exposure to just single agents. And so that's the reality that we're trying to sort out as we think about the causes of cancer and what to do about it. So it's useful to think, as suggested here on this slide, that a cause is not a single component, but a minimal set of conditions that produce the outcome that we're interested in. And this applies to a number of different kinds of cancer, and we've just heard about lung, breast, and thyroid as being cancers that are actually that have increased in recent decades, and there are others as well, that they're actually a collection of risk factors that coalesce to create conditions out of which these cancer patterns arise. And to complicate this, if some of these risk factors interact with one another, it actually makes it difficult for us to answer the question about what's responsible. What caused this cancer, or what's causing these cancer patterns? So there's this concept of the etiologic fraction, which epidemiologists talk about, which is the fraction of cases that are caused by a particular exposure. And what you will conclude as to the etiologic fraction of any particular cancer will depend a lot on what you think about the biology underlying that. So, for example, if you were interested in the etiologic fraction, the fraction of cases caused by exposure to an environmental chemical or pollutant, you would have to have some thinking about what are the ways in which that chemical or pollutant can interact with our biology to create the conditions out of which cancer arises. And cancer biologists will sort of argue about that and study it and so on, and will come up with different estimates of the etiologic fraction depending on where they come down on the answer to that question. And typically what cancer biologists do and epidemiologists do is say, well, let's sort of try to conceptualize this using different kinds of models that graphically represent the way we think about this complex issue of multiple factors coming together. And so one of the most common models that's used is the concept of causal webs. And I just wanted to briefly mention a paper that was published in 1994 by an epidemiologist by the name of Nancy Krieger, who noted in the first sentence of her paper, she says, multiple causation is the canon of contemporary epidemiology, and its metaphor and model is the web of causation, the web of causation. But then Nancy asked, has anyone seen the spider? And she went on in this paper to ask the question about who or what determines the threads that are woven into this causal web. And she pointed out that historically what had been going on when the causal web was developed and thought about was we thought about individual risk factors. It was a biomedical model of disease, smoking, drinking, certain individual kinds of behaviors, and other exposures. And she was making the case that we ought to have a more ecosocial model of disease to understand the emergence of cancer and other chronic diseases with multiple causes. And she was not alone. There were epidemiologists by the name of Mervyn and Ezra Susser at Columbia University who at the same time were writing papers and commentaries in the medical literature arguing for a more multi-level ecosocial model for understanding the origins of cancer and other chronic diseases. Geoffrey Rose was a British epidemiologist who, prior to the publication of this particular paper, had made a very important point in a paper that he wrote that was called Sick Individuals and Sick Populations. And he pointed out that the causes of a case of a particular disease are very different from the causes of the incidence of that same disease in a population. He said in that paper, the reasons why this particular person has hypertension is a very different question from why do some populations have more hypertension than others. And we could apply that thinking to cancer quite easily. Why this particular person has lung cancer is a very different question from why do some populations have more lung cancer than others, or breast cancer for that matter. So we're then being encouraged to think about different models that would include these multi-level variables that are more suitable to thinking about population health. And this ecosocial model can be represented in this way. There are a number of other ways to do it, but it recognizes that an individual person is progressively nested within a family and then a community, an ecosystem, and then society at large. And featured in this model is a lot of interaction across those levels. There's interaction of all kinds of variables, and you could easily imagine what those interactions are. And you can also see reflections of each of those levels down in the biology of an individual person at the tissue and the cellular and even the subcellular level. Racism, stress, other features of the multiple upper levels can be reflected in the biology of a person. So if we apply this thinking to cancer, I've listed here on this vertical axis a number of these multi-level variables that can influence cancer risk. It's a complicated list, but they fall into certain categories. Certainly there's the genetic background of individual people, and then there are the individual behaviors, which historically have gotten so much attention: smoking, alcohol consumption, diet, and so on. But then begin to think about, well, diet and nutrition, and what about food access in a community? What's the food environment look like from which will influence what a person actually eats? There are toxic chemicals. We can see them in food, air, and water pollutants, for example. They're in workplace and community level exposures that influence not only individuals, but entire populations of people because of the milieu in which we all live. There's socioeconomic variables, both at the individual and neighborhood level, stress, particularly toxic chronic stress, racism, obesity, the built environment, radiation, biologic agents. Now, this covers a whole range of issues, and for the clinicians in the audience, you'll recognize areas where you do your work, and for public health people, you'll recognize where you do your work, and policy people will recognize where you do your work. But these all have some influence on cancer risks in our communities, either directly or indirectly by altering the susceptibility of people to other exposures. So there's an opportunity here to think about how we integrate our work as we think about trying to approach this through this eco-social model. And finally, I just want to point out that there's a time dimension to this model as well. And by that, I mean that the timing of exposures or events can be extraordinarily important. Mary just mentioned cancer prevention starting in utero and continuing throughout the life course. And we know a lot about how certain exposures during particular windows of vulnerability of childhood development can have lifelong impacts. So that the tendency towards developing cancer at some point during your lifetime can actually start very, very early in life. And then we need to think about the duration of exposures and recognizing also that most cancers have a fairly long latent period. It varies from one cancer to the other. But things that happen early in life can influence the likelihood of developing a cancer decades later, as we'll see. I do want to make just a couple of comments about obesity and cancer because it's often one that's not thought about as related to cancer, but in fact there are a number of different kinds of cancer shown here on this slide that where obesity is a risk factor, an important one for us to keep in mind. And some research has been done to try to understand how obesity relates to cancer risk. Some of the biology involves increased levels of inflammation, changes in hormone levels, and other sort of relationships in the crosstalk between adipose tissue and tumors that can influence tumor development and growth. But then, of course, the question is, well, what contributes to obesity? And we all have our ideas about that. We think about diet and exercise as being foundational, and yes, that's true, but we can also think about that as at a community level that has to do, as I mentioned earlier, with the food environment, or is the neighborhood safe that a person can get out and exercise and get healthy amounts of exercise in a safe environment. So even that has a community level dimension to it. There are other things like smoking during pregnancy and stress, which all increase the risk of obesity. But I just want to point out that an emerging area of research that we should keep our eye on is this whole idea of obesogens, which are chemicals that actually can increase the number of fat cells that develop from stem cells or increase the storage of fat in fat cells or alter the rate of their birth and destruction. And this has been shown in experimental studies now for a number of different chemicals, animal data, in laboratory data, and so forth. And some of the early epidemiology is also showing a relationship between obesity risk and exposure to some of these chemicals as well. I've listed a few here: phthalates, plasticizers, to which we're all commonly exposed to, bisphenol A, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, some pesticides, there are flame retardants and air pollution. So keep in mind that this is an emerging area that we'll want to keep in mind as potentially contributing to the obesity problems. I also want to make just a couple of comments about chemical carcinogens. There's an international agency called the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Their headquarters are in France, but it is truly an international agency. And what they do is they periodically do a deep dive into the literature to study the cancer-causing potential for various chemicals. And then they have a very systematic process of going through that, and then they rank chemicals as being in group 1 or some other group. And group 1 chemicals in the IARC classification are chemicals that are known to be carcinogenic to humans. So those are clearly shown to be carcinogenic. They have other classifications of probably carcinogenic, possibly carcinogenic, and so on. But just for the group 1, known to be carcinogenic to humans, they published a paper a few years ago showing that for those chemicals, they had one or more of these characteristics, that they shared one or more of these characteristics. It's not just that they cause gene mutation or that they're toxic to genes, but they showed that these group 1 carcinogens also could induce oxidative stress, chronic inflammation, suppress the immune system, and so on. Made the point that we need to think about various mechanisms by which environmental chemicals can cause cancer. Now, this is not to say that a chemical that has one or more of these characteristics will automatically be a group 1 carcinogen, but it is to say that all group 1 carcinogens have these, one or more of these. And so if we see these in a chemical, we should be thinking about whether or not it might be contributing to cancer. And I think we're going to be hearing more later today about some of these mechanisms and how they might play a role. So let me move quickly now from etiology to prevention. The historic emphasis on individual risk factors, as I mentioned, and we're also beginning to see happily, a growing emphasis on limiting medical radiation exposures in hospitals during medical care, both medical care and dental care as well, to try to limit that as much, particularly in children who are particularly susceptible to radiation exposures. But the question for today also is, what do we add and why? And if we prioritize, how do we prioritize? And given the multifactorial nature of cancer, what are our challenges and opportunities for working on multiple factors simultaneously? So as we move from etiology to prevention, a final model that I want to just bring up here comes from an epidemiologist at Washington University by the name of Kenneth Rothman, who has developed what he calls a sufficient causal model. And as I mentioned, a cause is not a single component, but it's a minimal set of conditions. And what Rothman is pointing out here, and on this image I've shown here, several wedges in this pie. Now, the details are not all that important, except to point out several of them have to do with biologic effects of exposure to tobacco. One has to do with radon. One has to do with obesity. One has to do with an inherited defect, ability to repair defects in the DNA. And what his point is, you need to have all of these wedges together in this sufficient causal model before the disease appears. And if one of those wedges is missing, you no longer have conditions that are sufficient to cause cancer to occur. So the point then is, it becomes apparent that if any one of those wedges is missing, it represents, if you can just avoid adding that final wedge, you've achieved prevention. And so even if this pie starts getting put together early in life, as long as it's not complete, the cancer will not appear. And so he points out also that, of course, that interactions are a primary feature here, but also this is the time for us to keep in mind that this is just one way of moving to lung cancer. This is just one sufficient causal pie. But there are other component causes that could come together to create this sufficient causal pie. And we're going to be hearing about some of them today with regard to lung cancer itself. And I've just listed a few here on this slide. Criteria: air pollutants, diesel exhaust, lots of different hazardous air pollutants, industrial chemicals, silica, metals, and so on. And the point being that there are a number of ways you can assemble a sufficient causal pie to create lung cancer, but that means there are a number of ways that we can keep that causal pie from being put together and prevent the lung cancer from occurring. So a final sort of point I want to make addresses a common problem that we run into when thinking about cancer prevention. And this is this notion of population attributable fraction, which is an estimate of the reduction in cancer incidence that would occur if we were entirely unexposed to a particular risk factor. And there are ways of calculating that, and I won't go into it. But But as I pointed out, since there are many, many kinds of cancers are caused by different combinations of risk factors, and that these individual risk factors often overlap with each other and interact with each other, we cannot take these population attributable fractions and add them up and expect to end up at 100% of cancers. In fact, if we start adding them up, we end up with more than 100% of cancers. And the reason I'm going into this is because this concept is often misused. It's often misused to de-emphasize or ignore certain prevention opportunities. There are a variety of strategies that can reduce cancer incidence, and we ought to be looking for them and not be confined to looking at just single population attributable fractions from a particular single risk factor. And finally, with regard to breast cancer, there's a breast cancer prevention plan for the state of California that right now is being put together, being headed up by a group called the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners with funding from the state of California, doing a systematic look at a whole collection of risk factors that are known to contribute to breast cancer, and to figure out how to put them into a plan that could be applied across the state. This is something to keep an eye on as you think about breast cancer prevention here. It's complicated. This is a model that was put together by Bob Hyatt at UCSF a couple of years ago, looking at how we put all those things together for breast cancer. But you'll notice that they fall into several domains: physical, chemical, behavioral, sociocultural, and so on. And the point here is that there's an opportunity for people who are working in various silos to integrate their thinking while continuing to do the things that they do best. So we think about this as a systems problem that needs system responses. So in summary, multiple interacting variables, unique combinations can lead to cancer. And I do want to point out a comment. I want to pull this quote from a paper that Dick Clapp and Molly Jacobs wrote several years ago. It's impossible to know how these components add up to a specific proportion of the total cancer burden. It's not necessary to propose a hierarchy or play one component cause off against another, fostering competition rather than collaboration. So I would suggest looking for strategic opportunities to collaborate with others, working throughout these causal webs with the goal of disrupting the web integrity and preventing cancer as well as other diseases. And I have some recommendations here in the research, policies, and practice areas, which I'll be happy to share with the organizers and others as we put together our thoughts. But I do think for clinicians, for example, terribly important to take and record routinely environmental health histories, beginning in childhood, obstetrics, pediatrics, medicine, occupational health, and so on, and then act on the responses to those and look for opportunities to advocate beyond the clinical space, but out in the community more broadly. And to think about program and data integration and collaboration across silos. And thanks, I want to again thank Dick, Polly Hoppen, Molly Jakes, and David Kriebel, who for their collaboration on these and other topics over many years. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ted. Ted makes it look so easy, doesn't he? But the challenge of being able to describe these complex issues is really a communications challenge, even once you understand the science. And I think we're refining our ability to talk effectively to people working at the clinical individual level as well as people working at the population level. But feedback on Ted's talk, for example, and other talks over the course of the day about how this is landing on you as people wearing different hats with different areas of expertise would be really helpful in our collaborative efforts. So we hope to hear some of that from you a little later.